In the following, I present our Eurobis paper that is investigating effects of human protagonists on a narrative visualization about cerebral small vessel disease. Narrative visualization plays an increasing role in communicating data to a general audience of non-experts. In a medical context, it can be used to educate the public and increase health literacy of communities. It can make educational material more engaging and thus has potential to reach a larger audience. Narrative medical visualizations often contain different human protagonists, such as patients or physicians, whose influence on user perception we have investigated in this work. By combining narrative techniques with medical visualizations, we create data-driven disease stories. Disease stories are especially interesting to communicate avoidable risk factors so that the audience can make informed lifestyle choices. The contributions of our work are a human character-driven story structure for narrative visualization of diseases that is inspired by Campbell's hero's journey, an analysis of the impact of different protagonists of a narrative visualization of disease on users, and finally, a set of evaluation criteria and concrete approaches for their measurement, bridging the space between prior work in the fields of narrative visualization and health narratives. We used the example of cerebral small vessel disease. We worked together with our partners from the University Hospital of Magdeburg to create a data-driven story about this widely spread but mostly unknown disease. Cerebral small vessel disease is a very common condition in the elderly population, leading to damages in the brain tissue, and is often associated with dementia. However, simple measures like proper adjustment of one's blood pressure and a general healthy lifestyle can prevent this disease from developing. Traditional stories, as well as data-driven stories, often contain characters. Characters can be humans or objects, for example patients, organs, or diseases, in the context of disease storytelling. Furthermore, characters can be classified as either protagonists, which are defined as main characters the user can sympathize with, antagonists, which are opponents of the protagonists, or supporting characters, which are side characters that support the protagonist. However, due to the fact that the protagonist needs the audience's sympathy, a disease cannot be described as such. For our study, we focused on the protagonist as the only human character in our story that is introduced using names and images. This way, we want to avoid supporting characters to influence our study results, so that our results can be clearly attributed to the protagonist. Freytag's pyramid is a popular structure that was used in several other works about narrative visualization. However, neither does it help us with choosing a character, nor does it serve as a template to order different content pieces of the story. An alternative structure that is also very popular in entertainment media is Campbell's hero's journey. The structure is centered around a protagonist describing different stages in the story in chronological order. In the context of disease stories, a typical protagonist can be either a patient or a physician. We adapted Campbell's hero's journey to create a template for disease stories. We start with a hook to spark readers' interest in our story. Then, the story begins by introducing the protagonist, in this case a patient, in their normal life. Emerging symptoms or preventive screening creates awareness of a present disease. The patient visits a doctor who acts as a mentor as the story progresses. Diagnostics may include various tests and medical imaging methods. This leads to a final diagnosis, introducing the disease as antagonist of our story. Several treatment options might help to overcome the disease. Additionally, the adoption of a healthier lifestyle can be part of getting better. In the end, after adherence of treatment and lifestyle changes, a disease might become chronic or show remission. We end by showing credits to inform the users who created the story. Campbell's hero's journey is arranged in a circle because the overall goal of the protagonist is to return to their normal life. These stages are divided into 3 acts. Departure describes how the protagonist starts the journey. During initiation, the main part of the story takes place and the key information is presented. Return describes how the protagonist's journey comes to an end. Furthermore, Campbell's hero's journey differentiates between events the protagonist is familiar with and events the protagonist is likely facing for the first time in their life, and which may be therefore needed to be described in more detail. This is our patient-centered structure. We also did the same for the physician as protagonist. Here you can see excerpts from the 3 story versions. We kept the overall design similar throughout all of them. The first row shows the introduction of the protagonists, being the fictional patient, called Emma, and our clinical partner, the physician, called Miss Schreiber. For our base story without a protagonist, we introduced the disease itself. In the second row, we used the following phrases. For the patient-centered story, we use Emma, like 10% of female CSVD patients, is between 50 and 60 years old. About 20% of male patients are between 50 and 60 years old. For the physician-centered story, we use Mrs. Schreiber observed that 10% of her female patients and 20% of her male patients with CSVD are between 50 and 60 years old. And for the base story, we used 10% of female CSVD patients and 20% of male CSVD patients at the University Hospital in Magdeburg are between 50 and 60 years old. In the third row, we used the phrases "The MRI made it clear that Emma really does have CSVD" for the patient-centered version. "The MRI made it clear that one of Mrs. Schreiber's patients really does have CSVD" for the physician-centered version, and "The MRI made it clear that this patient really does have CSVD" for the base story. In the brain visualizations, you can see that the damage caused by CSVD is highlighted in orange. The protagonists are included through the text and, in case of the patient, icons. For our study, we investigated previous work done in the research fields of narrative visualization and health narratives. The former is focusing on data-driven storytelling by creating visualizations, with very few studies targeting scientific or medical visualizations. The latter is investigating health-promoting narratives, which are rarely including visualization. Based on our literature review, we chose a set of evaluation criteria. This includes user engagement, the emotional response to the presented information, self-referencing and identification of users with the story, the perceived credibility of the story, and its perceived length. We conducted a user study for which we created 3 versions of the same story about cerebral small vessel disease, with a patient as protagonist, a physician as protagonist, and no human protagonist. We acquired 34 participants, each of them seeing only one version of the story. The whole study containing the interactive story and a subsequent questionnaire were done online. The results were used to evaluate 5 different hypotheses. We hypothesized that disease stories including a human protagonist are more engaging. In our evaluation, we asked about 4 different attributes of engagement, and indeed, 3 of them scored noticeably higher in stories with human protagonists. We also assumed that the motivation to change the personal lifestyle is higher when viewing a story with a human protagonist. We asked about current behavior and intended behavior regarding 6 aspects that were presented as being risk factors of the disease. However, this hypothesis was rejected, since the results did not allow us to see a general difference between stories with and without human protagonists. Our third hypothesis was that users can identify the most with the patient as the protagonist, leading to a higher degree of self-referencing. Self-referencing is describing the process when users transfer the story's content to their own lives. Again, we had to reject this hypothesis. We cannot say that a high identification level results in a high degree of self-referencing. We can observe a slight tendency that the self-referencing is highest for the patient-centered story, although identification is higher for the physician. We hypothesized that users rate the credibility of the information higher when it is presented by a physician. The character credibility was slightly higher for the physician, but this does not seem to have influenced the user's impression of the overall story. The credibility was rated similarly high for all story versions, showing only a slightly higher score for the patient-centered story. Our last hypothesis was that users are more willing to spend time viewing a story when they can follow a human protagonist. None of the story versions was considered to be too long by the participants. By measuring the time participants stayed in the stories, we found out that participants on average stayed longer in the stories including human protagonists, which is in line with our hypothesis. However, they were not really curious about the characters after viewing the story and only slightly curious about the disease in case of the patient-centered story and the story without human protagonist. These results have to be considered carefully, taking into account our study design. Our study is based on a single example of a disease study, and our acquired number of participants is too small to be statistically representative. Furthermore, all participants had some motivation to view the story. Otherwise, they would not have participated in the study. Therefore, we cannot make statements about how users who come across the versions by chance, for example by browsing the internet, would perceive them. Despite facing some limitations in our study, we are able to present some lessons we learned, as well as ideas for future work. We were able to see that engagement was increased for stories containing human protagonists. Thus, we encouraged authors to include human characters in the stories. We learned that our brief introduction of the different characters was not enough to allow participants to identify with them. Since character-driven stories are brought to life by the protagonists, their characters should be carefully presented in more depth. We were further encouraged by that users did not find the story too long. The credibility of our story was perceived as high through all story versions, independent of the presence of a human protagonist. We assume that showing that the story was created by reputable and trustworthy institutions has as much or even more influence on credibility as the presentation of a domain expert in our study. Thus, building trust with your audience is not only possible by introducing an expert character. Even though the versions with human protagonists were the same length, we can see a noticeable difference in the user's assessment of whether the length was appropriate. Therefore, we assume that giving the user a feeling of telling a whole story, for example following a patient through the course of a disease, is more important than the actual length of the story. We focused on a subset of protagonists and only one character per story. Other characters, such as family members and friends, might be similarly important and should be included in future studies. Furthermore, other disease stories, for example about well-known diseases like cancer, might influence the user's perception in another way. Future studies are needed to investigate whether certain protagonists are particularly good at conveying information about prevention, screening, or coping. Regarding identification, the influence of using realistic protagonists by including photos compared to stylized comic-like characters should be investigated. Another interesting point for future work is to investigate the effects of presenting multiple protagonists, for example, patient and physician in the same story. Following this link, you can experience our stories yourself. However, they might not work on mobile devices. Thus, I recommend you to use a computer or laptop for viewing them. With this, I'm at the end of my talk and want to thank you for your attention.